I do identify as European. I hold a European passport, and as such, I am afforded all of the rights and privileges of an EU citizen. So in that way, I think that I do identify with Europe and the European Union. However, I'm also a dual citizen and did not grow up in Europe or the European Union. So in that sense, I don't think that European is my sole identity. I think it just forms a part of my story. As it is for many people, my formative European moment was my study abroad experience as an undergrad student. As I'm from the US, I did not participate in an Erasmus program as many EU students do, but I participated in a US program that allowed me to study in Spain for about 6 months. And I remember very vividly that as I was preparing all of the different documents and kind of necessary things to come over, I didn't have to get a visa to come and study in Spain, which was unnecessarily shocking to me. I think that I figured if I was coming to Europe as a US student, they would recognize me solely as such, but as I have an EU passport, it quickly became clear to me that I would be sort of seen as an EU student. So I think at that time I kind of realized the role of Europe and the EU in my own personal experience before I think I had really only looked at Ireland, which is where my citizenship is held, as well as where most of my family lives. So that had really been the primary aspect of my European experience. But that moment of visa-free travel, visa-free study, and that freedom of movement really kind of showed me what Europe meant to me in my own personal life, rather than just as kind of an institution that I would read about. In my opinion, the worst moment in recent European history is the refugee and migration crisis of 2015 and 2016. As many scholars have demonstrated, it's perhaps more accurately referred to as a crisis of governance, as the numbers and the statistics of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and people on the move did not spike or increase as much as the media would like us to think. So it wasn't necessarily a crisis of increased numbers arriving in the European Union, but rather a crisis of European Union governance, that member states were not able to sort of confront this new reality or sort of temporary change in what was going on. They were not able to do so as individual states, but they were also not able to do so as a collection. So I think that that really showed some fissures in the European Union at the time. The Common European Asylum System, which was built around the principle of solidarity and the fair sharing of what's often called the burden of refugees or asylum seekers, completely crumbled at the time. So states at the periphery, at the outer boundaries of Europe, felt the pressure, whereas inner states perhaps did not feel it in the same way. So I think that really revealed growing divides within the Union that were not necessary. They were not inevitable. I think that if the European Union had approached that situation differently and had governed in line with the values and principles that define it, I think that we would have seen some very different realities. And of course, the consequence of such governance was a large and concerning amount of human rights abuses. A number of individuals obviously were not treated with the kind of treatment that a European Union citizen would enjoy, and a lot of the legal guarantees that are supposedly given to asylum seekers and those that are coming into the European Union were also not afforded to those individuals at the time. So we've obviously seen a number of concerning images in the media, but I think that people really did not get a sense of why that was happening or how the European Union could have improved. So I think that really was the worst moment in the sense of obviously those human rights abuses, and on the other hand of a kind of demonstration of a failure in EU governance and a failure in EU collaboration, which served as a very concerning sort of sign, I think, of what was to come with respect to Brexit, the increasing rise of populism, and other moments that I would also consider negative that were definitely tied to that 2015-2016 time period. The best European moment in recent history, in my opinion, is the legalization of same-sex marriage in Ireland. This occurred in 2015 and was quite unexpected, I think, both within the country and for those that are familiar with the history and politics of the country. Ireland has a particularly Catholic history, and culturally speaking, for a very long time, Catholicism was intricately intertwined with state policy and sort of everyday life in the country. So I think that in 2015, when the country voted to legalize same-sex marriage, it was really a symbol that Ireland was adapting to the time period in which we are living, and finally sort of caved, perhaps isn't the right word, but sort of adapted to what we can now consider a modern society or a progressive society. And I think that was really meaningful for Ireland and sort of a step forward as they began to look at other policies that really were pretty antiquated, including, for example, the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, which made abortion illegal. I think that 2015 same-sex marriage vote really sort of paved the way for that progress. I think it also demonstrated the way in which a vote or sort of political involvement can mobilize the energy and the involvement of the citizens of a country. In Ireland at the time, there were all kinds of efforts to get Irish people who had expatriated or were temporarily living abroad to come home to vote, as you could only vote in person at that time. So I think it really showed that involvement and really the duties of citizenship and voting and those kinds of things are still relevant in this time, even though voting has kind of decreased in a lot of places over the past few years. I think that vote really symbolized that people can care, and if they are able, and if they sort of see the relevance of a particular referendum or a particular political choice, they will get involved and they will sort of form part of their own future, per se, in the sort of present writing of history, which I think was really important. The most important thing that the EU has done for me personally is it has granted me an incredible privilege of the freedom of movement within the European Union. I am very lucky in that I hold 2 passports of regions in the world that are afforded almost the most movement around the globe, whereas there are certain countries and regions that are afforded very little movement or very restricted movement. So I think personally, having a passport in the European Union has allowed me to live, work, study, travel, and exist in this region without sort of the limitations of a visa or of a passport that does not afford such liberty. I think while that has obviously been a benefit for me, it really comes with sort of two sides, because obviously that freedom being granted to me means that in many cases it is denied to others. So I think that the freedom of movement is a wonderful principle of the European Union, but also shows that at the end of the day, movement is not a liberty for many, and a book of paper in the form of a passport determines where you can live, work, study, exist, find a livelihood. And for me, that is increasingly problematic as our societies globalize and sort of see movement as an essential aspect of daily life. I think that even now, during the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen a very swift closure of borders and incredible limitations on movement that are quite unprecedented in at least my living history, and I think sort of the past 100 years. And I think a lot of societies that, for example, benefit from incredible amounts of migrant labor are realizing and recognizing how important a number of different members of their societies are, even if they were previously invisible. So while European Union citizens can move throughout the Union, those that are not given that privilege cannot. And I think obviously it extends beyond the rights of migrant laborers. You can look at any number of examples from sort of the migration policy, asylum policy, all of those different aspects of movement, both within the EU and around the globe, to see that movement really is becoming a very important aspect of our daily lives. And I think if the EU continues to limit it and restrict it for those that do not hold the passport of the EU, I think it will definitely become an issue and a challenge for the EU as an institution and as a region. By 2030, I would like the EU to shift their currently restricted lens towards migration and movement to a more open and realistic understanding of migration, both within the European Union and into the European Union. I think that the past 10 years have demonstrated, as I mentioned previously, the increasing relevance of movement in our societies as we globalize and sort of take on whatever challenges come. And I think that the EU, unfortunately, has not adapted in the ways that I would have liked them to adapt. I think the creation of Frontex, the increasing securitization of the outer borders and the outer peripheries of Europe is incredibly concerning, and the idea of Fortress Europe, as it's often called, is particularly alarming. So despite the fact that over the past 5-10 years, such restrictions have come into place, in the next 5 or 10 years, I would like to see those restrictions relaxed, and I would like to see a more realistic and comprehensive policy surrounding migration, refugee movement, asylum seeker movement, generally sort of policy surrounding movement, not only for those that hold EU citizenship, but also for those that do not. I think that that is a really essential part of a modernizing European Union, and I think that without that change, the European Union will begin to resemble sort of concerning trends from both the past and the present in terms of that closed-off society and a closed-off region. I think that diversity and unity and sort of the delicate balance between the two are really, really essential as we move into this next decade, as we confront whatever challenges may arise. Again, with respect to the current moment and the coronavirus pandemic, we've already seen a spike in sort of xenophobic and anti-immigrant rhetoric, but at the same time have also seen the essential role that immigrants and people from migration backgrounds play in our societies, not only as essential health workers, for example, at the moment, but as people who are members of our communities, regardless of their country of origin or their culture of origin. So I think if the EU continues to restrict such movement and such diversity, it really will continue to be an issue for the Union and for the region and its future.